Hey y'all, I'm Hope. Welcome back. Today I'm talking about all the books that I read in October. This was a pretty interesting month because most of what I read was for class and I enjoyed most of it. The other couple of things that I read were some short ebooks and audiobooks that I fit in between everything else. But I read 6 books in October, which is pretty close to my average, usually like 6 or 7. And I'm pretty happy with that. And again, mostly class reading, but it was really an interesting selection of class reading, and I thought that every book that we read for class was, even if I didn't necessarily like them, I thought that the reading experience was interesting. So overall, it was a fun month, and I had a great time reading this month. I think because they don't have them physically, I'm going to talk about the 2 shorter things that I read first, and then I'll talk about the stuff that I read for class. So the 2 shorter things I read were, first of all, Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Stephen Graham Jones, which is a very short story. I think it's about 35 pages long, but it follows this woman named Jenna who 2 years ago, her boyfriend broke her heart after he had left to work on this oil rig, and she receives a letter from him kind of breaking up with her, and he really embarrassed her and just made her feel awful. And now 2 years later, he's back in town and she wants revenge. And while she's trying to kind of figure out how she's going to deal with him being back in town, she finds a car that wants blood sacrifices. And that's all I can really say without spoiling the story, because it doesn't really go in directions that you would expect. But I thought that this was really fun. I always really enjoy Stephen Graham Jones' writing and the way he writes characters, because they always feel very much like real people to me. And I enjoy kind of that aspect of it, especially since it's horror. It always gives you someone that you feel like you can really root for. So I always like that in his books. This one also just is kind of insane, particularly near the end, in the sense that, I could never have predicted what was going to happen, and I really enjoyed that part of it as well. My only gripe with this was because it was so short, I really wanted to know more about Jenna and about the guy that she wanted revenge on, and given that it was so short, I just couldn't get that extra backstory. But that being said, I thought this was really fun, and if you at all like horror, I think it's worth reading, because it was a good time, and also had some really interesting twists that I didn't see coming. The other short thing I read was I listened to an audiobook of Small Spaces by Catherine Arden, which is a middle grade horror book that I just heard good things about. I thought it would be fun for spooky season, and it was. It was a good time. This one, it follows Ollie, who's 11, and her mother has died, I think about a year before the book starts. And while dealing with her continuing grief over the loss of her mother, Ollie has kind of withdrawn from the world a little bit and become very interested in mostly just kind of reading and avoiding people. But she comes across this book and begins reading it right before she goes on this field trip, and it's the story of someone who made a deal with something called, I think he's called the Smiling Man. And Ollie's reading the story, she's like, oh, this is really fun and spooky. And then they go on a class field trip and she finds the graves of the people involved in the story and realizes that there might be more to it than she thought. And from that point forward, things completely go haywire. I thought this was really a fun, spooky read. The horror elements in here are surprisingly creepy for something that is aimed at younger audiences. It kind of reminded me of, if you've ever played any of the Nancy Drew games, they're, surprisingly scary. You're just kind of having fun playing a mystery, and then all of a sudden, you're getting the shit scared out of you by a ghost. It's really surprisingly creepy. And I think that this has that similar kind of vibe to it. I really enjoyed the horror elements. I thought it was very spooky. There's a lot of fun dynamics, too, with Ollie and her 2 friends that she's kind of going on this adventure with. Or, I don't know if I'd call it an adventure, I guess. She's trying to escape with them. And I also really liked the way that this book dealt with the topic of Ollie's grief, because it was very central to the story, and I think that it played into Ollie's decisions in really interesting ways. So overall, I really enjoyed this. I would highly recommend it if you've got a younger kid that likes something spooky or is wanting to try something spooky. I thought this was a great book. Okay, so the rest of the stuff I read was for class, and I'll go through them, I think, in the order that I read them. So the first one that I read was Cormac McCarthy's Outer Dark, which I didn't know what to expect from this. I know that Blood Meridian and The Road are 2 books of his that are quite popular here on BookTube. I've seen a lot of people talk about those. I haven't read either. I'd never read from him before, and I just really didn't know what to expect going into this one, but I really enjoyed it. I thought the writing was really interesting. There's no quotation marks, which threw me off, and it took me a little bit to kind of adjust to that and get used to figuring out who was talking. Once I'd adjusted, I really had no problem with it, and I thought that it was just a really fascinating reading experience because the story is so bizarre and meandering, but I still, like, couldn't put it down. It just kept me engaged the whole time. But this follows a brother and sister named Culla and Renthi in some kind of indeterminate part of the US South, and they are in this isolated cabin when Renthi gives birth to Culla's child, and Culla tells her that the baby dies and he leaves it in the forest, but Renthi thinks he's lying, and so she goes on a quest to find her baby, and Culla then goes on a quest to find Renthi. And the two of them go on these kind of separate journeys. And at the same time, there's these three mysterious strangers who are wandering through the countryside, causing havoc in various places. So those things kind of all weave together throughout the story. I don't even know what else to say about it. I enjoyed this. It was a very strange book. And I think particularly like the last 30 pages are really bizarre. And I really didn't know what to make of them. But it was an interesting reading experience, and I would definitely read from Cormac McCarthy again. Then the next thing we read was The Wind Done Gone by Alice Randall, which is a parody of Gone with the Wind, which was also an interesting reading experience, but for a different reason, which is that I know nothing about Gone with the Wind. I've never read the book, I've never seen the movie, and I really don't care to, not even after reading this. So I spent a lot of time just kind of confused, because it has, like, nicknames for everybody, and it very clearly is referring to people who are characters in the original story, and I'm like, I have no idea who these people are. It took me like half the book to realize that the character with the initials RB was supposed to be Rhett Butler. It took me half the book to figure that out. So that was interesting just in terms of being lost because I didn't know the original story it was based on. But I think that this story is strong enough on its own that I didn't really care that I was missing those elements. This follows Sonara, who is the half-sister of the Scarlett O'Hara? Scarlett O'Hara? Whatever her name is, Scarlett's, like, half-sister. And it's following her kind of through the events of Gone with the Wind, but also following after. And it's all written as if it's diary entries that she has recorded, just recounting parts of her life. And it was really interesting. I liked that format. It made it very quick to read. I got through this in about a day or so. I enjoyed Sonara's perspective. I really enjoyed Sonara as a character, and I think that the kind of personal journey she goes in across the story is interesting because she starts out being very, I don't know, she's very connected to RB throughout the various parts of the story, through most of the story, but I think particularly in the latter half, she really grows beyond that and kind of gains new appreciation for herself and figures out kind of what she really wants for herself. And I just really enjoyed reading that journey for her, and it was a good time. I enjoyed reading this one. And then we read Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward. This is another author I was familiar with prior to reading, similar to Cormac McCarthy, but I'd never read any of her books before, and I will definitely be reading more from her in future. I really enjoyed this book. This follows Esh and her family as they are preparing for Hurricane Katrina in southern Mississippi, and it follows them in about, I think, the week preceding the hurricane, and then to a couple days beyond that, while a series of events unfold between Esh, her brothers, and their friend group that kind of alter their lives in other ways. So I really enjoyed this for the different characters, like just the way the different characters are portrayed. I think Esh is really interesting. I also think her brothers, Skeeta and Randall, are really interesting. And there's this wider friend group that plays into the story in ways that I thought were very, like, realistic feeling. And I just enjoyed the writing as well. I think my favorite element of this is that Esh is actually actively reading Greek mythology throughout the story. And there's a particular myth that she's reading, and I'm not going to tell you which one because it kind of tells you part of what's going to happen in this book. But there's a particular myth that she's reading that she is reading across the timeline of the story. And her kind of personal character arc follows a little bit some of the elements of that myth. So I thought that was a really interesting way of kind of foreshadowing what was to come and also giving Esh kind of a reference point. Yeah, I don't even know what else to say about this because I think I'm still kind of, for all of these, I really think I'm still kind of digesting them weeks later. I think that these are just books that I'm going to continue to think about and kind of sit with for a while. That is not true of the last book that we read, because the last one we read was a class pick, And originally I was planning to read this in November because we just talked about it on, what's today, the 3rd. And I planned to read it like a day or so before, but we also had to watch some episodes of a TV show. So what we read was Dead Until Dark by Charlaine Harris, which is the first book in the Sookie Stackhouse series. And it's the book series that the TV show True Blood is based on. This was a time. It's not a good book. It is, I think, objectively awful. But I had a great time reading it. Like, it was so ridiculous, but I was really enjoying reading it. I got in my, like, group chat and was just, like, telling them about it, and they were asking questions. It was fun. Definitely a change from the kind of more literary things that we'd been reading. But it was interesting to go in and have the class discussion on that because I thought we had a really good discussion. But, like, parts of that discussion were also just us going, yeah, I don't think that this was a good book, but, like, maybe X. I think that the TV show is pretty spot on in terms of tone. Or not in terms of tone, but in terms of, like, the silliness level is almost exactly the same as the book. But Dead Until Dark is about Sookie Stackhouse, who is a waitress at a bar in small town Louisiana, and she can read minds. And then a vampire comes into town, and she cannot read his mind, and she gets involved with him, and a series of events unfold with her kind of like learning about the vampire world. And at the same time, there's a series of serial killings happening that Sookie kind of gets involved with trying to solve. So it's pretty like typical kind of paranormal romance with a mystery, but like really badly written. The writing is terrible, and the characters are very static. But again, it was just like a good time. I didn't have to think that hard about it. Like I was, because I was reading it for class, but it was just like fun because it was terrible. Anyway, those are all of the books that I read in October. Let me know if you've read any of these down in the comments and what your thoughts were, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.